Hello, my name is CJ Gross. I am the founder of Ascension Worldwide. I'm also the author of the book, What's Your Zip Code Story? Understanding and Overcoming Class Bias in the Workplace. And this video is a very special video because we're here to talk about gender equity and the invisible rules that hold women back in business. And here to join us in this conversation is Michelle Banik. Michelle is an accomplished global C-suite executive, the former chief people officer for a very large corporation in Canada, and a DEI champion, and so much more. I'll tell you a little bit more about Michelle later. And we also have Dr. Paul Harrietha, who is also a C-suite consultant, principal for CAP's leadership group, and the author of the book we're going to be talking about today. And it's entitled Invisible Rules: What's Really Holding Women Back in Business and How to Fix It. So welcome everyone to this conversation.
Thank you, CJ.
Thanks for having us, CJ.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know it was like a rocky beginning. I wanted to make sure I got out all of the information, but this is a conversation that's so important. And I just delivered a training for a pharmaceutical company in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that they found surprising when it came to gender equity, we usually put up slides that have specific data points on it. And there's two data points around gender. One is that in the United States specifically, on average, women make 62 cents on the dollar of what a man would make, according to the United States Department of Labor. But that's not what they find most surprising. What they find most surprising is that in order to close that pay gap, it's going to take 135 years to close the pay gap. And that was based on the World Economic Forum. So people are so surprised about that. And I think this conversation today is going to uncover some of the hidden factors that make that a potential reality or challenge. So let's start this conversation. And my first question is to you, Paul. So Paul, you're a man, you're a white man, right? Just want to make sure the identity. So you wrote a book on how to help women in the workplace, specifically women who are leaders, to overcome the biases, the gender biases. So why was writing this book important to you, being a man specifically?
Well, thank you for having me, CJ, and thank you for the question. So there are two elements here. One is, we'll just start with a very personal component, which was the book was motivated by the experiences of my wife, who today is a very senior executive and has managed to navigate the issues that she was forced to navigate to become that. And it's a sort of testament to her qualities, her abilities, and her grit. But the reality is, like so many women of her generation, she sort of plateaued in the early part of this century at a senior director level, just below the executive suite. And she was not alone. This was sort of a trend that you had all these high performing women who were bumping up against that ceiling at that level, not being able to move into that executive role. And we're wondering why, especially as they saw many men, often younger and arguably less qualified, jumping over them into the ranks. And so that became a fairly significant frustration and something that I ultimately wanted to look at. But it was also influenced just by the realities that I was facing as a senior executive and looking around the room with enhanced, social awareness, and realizing that most of the people that were sitting across the tables from me and we were answering to on boards were other white men. And so, this becomes a little disturbing when you think about it. To your point, we talk about the need for gender equity, and there has been some progress, but it's been glacially slow despite the considerable efforts of some very significant advocates and allies. And the reason is quite simply, and at the risk of offending some of my other white male colleagues, is it's because of a male power structure and a white male power structure. And as long as that is sustained, we're going to run into problems. The reality is gender equity is not a woman's issue or something that they can address on their own. If they would have done so a very long time ago. This is a challenge and a business opportunity that men and women are going to have to face together if we're going to get to anything resembling gender equity. And it ultimately becomes a business priority. So when we have men who become aware of the circumstances and advocate in a real way, not just on a lip service basis, we'll begin to see gender equity. If we don't make that change, then to your point, we're going to be looking at continued sort of glacial advancements, which are just bizarre in this day and age, but also for any business who's looking to compete on a straight up and global basis. That was the basis for the book, was to help build some of that awareness.
And I understand it also was your thesis.
It began life as a doctoral thesis, and would have ended there, except I had a couple of colleagues who read it and said, Paul, this is a message that you have to take more broadly, write a book. And one of those was a good friend of mine, Holly Catalfamo, who is the co-author of the book, who was one of my thesis advisors. And we only agreed to do it, given that I had a full-time gig as a CEO at the time, if she would join me. And that was the basis for the two of us writing the book.
Thanks, Paul. So to me, also, this also feels like allyship at a global scale, because when you write a book, you're looking at it from a macro perspective, which then leads to my next question for Michelle. Michelle, thank you so much for being on this call, because you have an extensive executive leadership background in Canada and globally. And so in the book, Paul talks about the rule number 3, one of the hidden rules. And I thought this was really interesting. It was the rule that women are supposed to be women. So what does that mean, and how does that present a double-edged sword? And you can also give the viewers just a little bit more information about your background, because it was incredible.
Oh, well, thank you so much, CJ, for having me here. You know, I've been really fortunate to have had a 25-year career in human capital, ranging across a diverse portfolio of companies, from a startup technology services company, right through to a $100 billion global investment organization. And during that time, really having the pleasure of being able to focus on how people and culture can be an organization's competitive advantage, if they focus on the right things. And creating really and truly inclusive spaces in organizations, I believe, is fundamental to really unlocking that competitive advantage. So having left my C-suite job at the end of 2019, I now get the opportunity to spend time in the boardroom, arguably on the other side of the table from where I was for so many years. And really helping as a member as an independent director and as a member of other boards to be able to advise on strategy while playing that oversight role and continuing the conversations around important topics like what we're discussing today. Rule number 3, women are supposed to be women. Many women are conditioned from a very early age to exhibit long-standing and deeply rooted gender stereotypes. Be nice, sit quietly, don't speak until you're spoken to. Whereas men from an early age are expected often to be aggressive, competitive, forceful, characteristics that to many are hallmarks of leadership. And those defined gender roles made their way into organizations and then started to become foundational to organizational tenets. And as Paul and Holly alluded to in their book, The Invisible Roles, by conforming to these gender roles, women typically fail to meet the male gendered expectations of what it means to be a leader. And while we know that being empathetic, supportive, collaborative are absolutely leadership traits, and we have needed them especially over the past 18 months. I was somewhat disheartened to have read in a recently released report, the Women in the Workplace report from McKinsey and the Lean In organization, that as women move into leadership roles, their day-to-day experiences often get more difficult. They continue to get more difficult. Compared to early career women, they're more than twice as likely, to be the only or the one woman in a room, right? They're also more likely to face microaggressions that challenge their competence. And the microaggressions that challenge their competence are not what their male counterparts are hearing. So they're being interrupted. There's questions about their emotional state. They're having their judgment questioned. So, the feeling of that double-edged sword doesn't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon.
So, Michelle, what I think is interesting is that you said that there is, men are kind of set up in a position where they or we have been kind of groomed, whether it's from childhood and definitely in the corporate environment, to be more aggressive, assertive, put your ideas out there, and women are not. And I think it's also interesting that we talk about empathy. So there's this work that Brene Brown does around empathy, vulnerability. And if men are taught to do the opposite, now we have to then retrain these men to be more empathetic, to have more of a inclusive viewpoint and perspective. Whereas sometimes, a lot of times, women actually already come with that kind of built in. And so I see that as an opportunity for organizations to capitalize on that. But, unfortunately, organizations are not really, exploring those options and causing more challenges there. So, Paul, let me ask a question for you. So what do men, specifically white men, need to know about understand about the invisible rules? So why are they important for leaders of organizations, specifically men, specifically white men, to know about these rules? Because I'm assuming they're not hidden to them.
Well, I think they might be in some respects. And I think that the most important thing that we need to work with men on is to have them understand that the rules do exist. There's a wonderful line from the book that says, when it comes to gender equity, women need coaching, and this has to do with behaviors around this issue and asserting themselves appropriately under circumstances, but men need education. Men need to become aware of the biases that exist, and more importantly, the behaviors that extend from those biases. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, maybe be a little controversial. And I'm going to suggest, as a proxy for all white male senior executives worldwide, so not to put too much stress on myself, that there is no primary or overriding conspiracy to sustain the existing power structure. It exists because men have adopted it, developed it, and have been rewarded for it. And so they tend to exhibit those behaviors that have gotten them to where they are. And then they tend to reinforce the structure by then seeking out, creating networks, promoting, and sponsoring men who act and look like they are.
Sure.
So the reality is, the big thing that we have to deal with is to make people aware of the biases. And this is your world, so you know more about this than I ever will, CJ. But if men were fully aware of the biases that they had, and by extension, the behaviors that they were adopting, and by extension, the negative impact that that's having both on their workforce and their business performance over time, that we will begin to see this movement toward gender equity. And that's part of why we wrote the book. The book was not written as a how-to for women. Women know how to do this, right? This isn't an old white dude saying, young lady, here's your answer. The book was written as much for people like me, men, as a vehicle to help build awareness and to help them advance their thinking and their behaviors as senior leaders in a world that requires value-based leadership, not traditional views of power structures and command and control leadership. And so that's what we're trying to do, is to find that wonderful combination that allows people to be authentic in the workplace and to bring their talents to the workplace rather than managing around the biases that exist.
Okay, cool. So this book is more so for the men, but it also has some tips in there for women as well.
Well, exactly. So tips again are just awareness building. This is the coaching. So many women will, we've seen this, and partially because it's socialized, this perception that if I just keep my head down and I work really hard and I do amazing stuff, people are going to recognize me and they're going to promote me. And it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So many times I've sat around the tables and the response has been, well, she's not complaining, so she must be happy. This guy's complaining, so we got to do something to keep him in the fold. And until we understand those dynamics and start managing those dynamics more effectively and rewarding people for that hard work and enthusiasm and other elements, we're going to continue to have these issues. And so once again, it's not about necessarily teaching the women how to do things differently.
Right.
There are some components, little strategies that you can adopt to help facilitate your movement up the ladder or expedite it. But again, it's really about looking at the systemic issues that are causing people to have to change their strategies or to adopt these strategies day in and day out to manage barriers that men don't face. And so that's what we're trying to do with the book.
So my assumption, and then I'll kind of ask the next question to Michelle. My assumption is the women would read this and it would be more validation, if anything. It's like, yes, this is what we're going through. And Michelle's shaking her head. So I'm gonna ask Michelle, the next question is, so what is some of the in your background, in your experience, and also the women that you see who are moving up the ladder or trying to move up the ladder, what is the biggest challenge you believe they face?
Well, it's interesting. So building on a comment that Paul just made, I think it's about systems and systemic things. So the systems that guide decision-making in organizations still feel as if they work against women.
So which are?
The systems, think broadly around decision making. So how individuals are attracted into the organization, how they're onboarded, how they're compensated, how they're developed, how they're promoted. And I used to believe that the systems were broken. I actually think that the systems are not actually broken. I think they are operating as they are designed. So we have a design issue here, and to Paul's earlier comment about education and awareness for men who have arguably architected many of these systems and these organizational tenets, we need to continue to double down on that effort and help them understand and have greater awareness about what needs to change. Women have multiple and intersecting identities, and that profoundly shapes their lived experiences at work. And despite a greater emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, organizations still have a lot more to do, frankly, to truly understand those lived experiences so that they can more effectively advance equity and inclusion for all women. And I believe that inspiration for real change when it comes to gender equity is a leadership commitment and accountability issue. And the tone needs to be set from the top by the board of directors. It means starting with its own assessment of its composition. It further demonstrates accountability by committing to greater gender equity policies and practices and commitments that ultimately sends a strong message. And in parallel, the lens then also needs to look internally. The leadership of the organizations need to be accountable for ensuring that they establish safe and brave spaces to dialogue with women to understand this, to really listen and learn, and frankly, unlearn in some cases to learn, and ask arguably three simple questions. What's getting better? What's getting worse? Because let's face it, things either get better or they get worse. There's really no gray. And how does that make you feel? And then commit to co-creating solutions, because fundamentally, co-creation is critical to making sustainable change, in my mind, when it comes to gender equity and inclusion.
So one of the things I saw on your LinkedIn profile was that you have a certification in design thinking. And my assumption is that co-creation is a part of that as you bring different perspectives in to solve a problem. Like, how can you solve a problem for me when I'm not involved, right? So
yes,
that's one thing that I'm hearing. So I want to ask you a question from a different perspective. So my mentor and I, we did some work up in Canada, and one of the things that we found with a militarized organization that I won't mention on this video, but one of the things that they did, and they've had multiple lawsuits, and they put a woman who had a very very similar background as many of the men. And my mentor, Dr. Lynn Scott, said, although there's a woman in charge, she has the same ideology as the men, which could potentially perpetuate this thinking. So in the book, The Invisible Rules, it talks about this, tug of war with the experience with women. Could you talk about that, and if you've had experience with that?
Well, you know what, CJ, you set that question up beautifully, because really the tug of war essentially highlights the fact that women have biases too, right? And women can be each other's worst critic. Just as the name suggests, women can be on opposing sides of embracing or rejecting these masculine traditions that are typically assigned to leadership. Mm-hmm. So on the one side of the spectrum, you have those willingly and happily subscribing to the male-dominated tendencies, because frankly, maybe that's how they've looked up and have seen those who have achieved success and career advancement doing X, Y, and Z. So thereby must subscribe to that. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you can often find those who focus on avoiding those behaviors at all cost. Mm-hmm. Right. So hence, the tug of war that ensues. And by the way, those that are on the opposing side of the side of rejecting those masculine traditions often are very comfortable doing that at even the cost of future career advancements, because it matters that greatly to them. So this tension that can get created as women pull arguably on either side of that spectrum creates that tug of war. The difficult thing is it can, if unchecked, it can lead to unfortunate and at times destructive behaviors, and ultimately, can lead at times to roadblocks to other success, sure. which as a woman who spent the majority of my career, frankly, working with a lot of men, I would think that would be a really continued emphasis in that respect would be really unfortunate outcomes, because I actually think, women, never mind men needing to do this, but women have a real opportunity to amplify each other's voices and participate in lifting each other up, rather than trying to figure out how we can keep each other down.
So can I pick up on that, CJ? Because this is a very important component of the book as well. And so just to echo your opening line, there's a great quote from the book that says, an old white woman who acts like an old white male is just another old white male. So there is some of that aspect, and it's not enough to have gender equity, a woman sitting on something and saying we're equitable. It really is. Right. It goes back to this issue of diversity of thought, right? Yes. But what you see in the worst case of tug of war is that queen bee syndrome. This notion of women separating themselves from other women to assert themselves and to become the dominant woman within the framework. The reality is you don't see that too often. And where you do see it, it's not necessarily a byproduct of an ill-informed or unfortunate, female leader. This is someone who's been trained in a hostile and unfortunate environment, who is adapting to a system that says, there are only a few seats at the table, and if I'm going to get there, I have to act in a certain way and assimilate a certain way. And the problem is, of course, is that it does lead to the suppression of other women in that environment. It also produces tokenism in some respects, where the organization can point to that woman as a representative of the diversity that they're seeing. And that becomes very negative. You'll often see a single female CEO, and everyone points to the organization and says, well, see, we believe in gender equity. Our CEO is a woman, when there's no one else within the next three levels of the organization. So where you do see that, that's usually an indication of a very unfortunate or very unhealthy organization with all of the systemic issues that Michelle talked about.
So to your case in point, I would say we worked with a military organization in the United States, and this was like what we consider the tip of the spear in terms of leadership, in command. And there were a cohort of 30 commanders, and we had 60 total. And out of the 60, there were 2 women. And when I asked what was the bias of the women, one woman said, "I have a bias against women at the gun range." And I said, "Oh, this is interesting. Tell me more," because all the men were like, "Why? I don't understand. I thought you were all together on this." And she says, "I have a bias against women who are at the gun range that raise their hand and need help, because what that does to the instructor is says that you as a woman are not, you need help. And in this, male dominated environment, that is a sign of weakness. I know that. And when you don't know that, I must exclude myself from that environment. If that means excluding you, I will do that to make sure that I secure my spot." And so, we see this time and time again. And so earlier I didn't show the book cover here. This is a beautiful book cover as well. But I have a question. So Paul, you interviewed 50 executive leaders for this book, which I think is got to turn off my notifications there, which is amazing. So I have a question. You from these interviews, you've come up with this CAPS framework, and I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about the CAPS framework and how does that support the concepts in the book.
Great. So yes, we talked to 50 women across Canada, executive level and above. So vice president or above, many board members, many C-suite executives, many CEOs. And we basically, given our early discussions, we're looking at asking 2 fundamental questions. Mm-hmm. So we just talking to these executives to say, why in your experience are women so badly underrepresented at senior levels in corporate Canada? And it's beyond corporate, right? It's public sector, it's all sectors. And then 2, what can we do about it? And 2, that sort of A and B is on an individual basis, and more importantly, on a systemic or organizational basis. And when we asked the question, the women gave us the invisible rules, and they basically said there are 4 key biases that all women face in the workplace that simply make it harder for them than men to achieve senior leadership status, and maybe even not even more difficult, impossible in some respects. And those were the 4 key biases. So we talked about, one was this prove it again, this need to outwork men on a sustained basis, and the fact that women tend to own risk for failure on both an individual and group level that men simply don't. The second was this idea of the tightrope, which is this need to sort of operate between likability and leadership that Michelle talked about earlier. Is if I'm align too closely to my gender expectations, then I'm viewed as likable but unleader-like. If I assert myself too aggressively, I'm viewed as a leader, but I become unlikable. So this is something that women have to
They have a word for that in the
States
that people have tried to avoid. But anyway.
Yes, I did the best to avoid it for you.
Good job. Good job.
We don't avoid it in the book because a lot of the women use it in the quote, right? The third is the maternal wall, just this whole notion that women still in Western society tend to have disproportionate responsibilities, not just for the birthing of children and all that entails in terms of being away from work and trying to reintegrate into a workplace as a mother, but also domestic responsibilities that just make it harder day in and day out to do what's necessary to serve at leadership levels. And then the third force with the tug of war that we just talked about. So those are the biases that women face, and they are realities, and they are potentially career threatening. They just make it exhausting for women to move beyond that senior direct level. But then we asked, okay, well, you've obviously made it. You are a senior female. How did you do it? And a lot of them, just as an aside, used the word luck. Well, I got lucky. yeah, again, that's a passive response on a socialized basis. You'll never hear a man. I've yet to hear a senior executive male go, "Yeah, I got lucky,"
What's their response? They
So,
work hard.
yeah, exactly. Oh, I'm brilliant. But we just asked them, so how did you do it? And what we did is in the data, the feedback was incredibly consistent. And Michelle was one of the people interviewed for the book, so she can nod at this point to say, yeah, that made sense.
It's true.
Is that they said, and it almost works as antidotes to the biases that you face, but that basically the CAPS means credentials, adaptability, profile, support. It's an acronym, but credentials is that women by and large, if they're very senior, tend to come to the table with greater credentials than their male colleagues and continue to accumulate those credentials over their careers. And this is a function of giving expert voice, right? The fact that there's instant credibility associated with the degrees, with the professional designations, with the experience that allows women to operate at the table and to voice their opinions at a table. So that's a big one, credentials. The adaptability is this learned capability, or innate in some cases, but learned capability to assert themselves situationally, to make their voice heard at meetings without becoming that word that we are not mentioning, and to balance that need to continue to be authentic and communal and all of those really positive things, but not to be afraid to raise their hands and to assert themselves and right up to asking for stretch assignments and promotions, which is not something that women are accustomed to doing and it's not sort of socialized not to do. The third is profile, and it's this need to develop and curate a profile. The simple reality is people can't hire, promote, or support people that they don't know. So, this is again, a process usually begins at the departmental level. You can go to organizational, you go to the industry, and ultimately culturally. Michelle's getting on that cultural side now as people are seeing her beyond business as a recognized expert nationally for her efforts. If you can get to there, then you get to pick and choose what jobs you want. But until that point, it's really hard to get there. And then the final support is a recognition. So many women are socialized and have this expectation that they're going to do it all. They're going to be the perfect mom. They're going to be the perfect housekeeper. They're going to be the perfect caregiver. They're going to be the perfect employee there. And you can't do it. You simply can't on a sustained basis. No one has that kind of energy. And so it was finally a recognition, often a reluctant recognition, that we have to offload some of this stuff. We have to seek support, right up to choose your partner appropriately, right? Are they supportive or are they not supportive? And if they're not supportive, that's going to be very difficult for you. Outsource support, and whether it's housekeepers, lawn support, dry cleaning, or just whatever it might be. And of course, the big one is nannies and other, which again creates a significant burden on women, in many cases, anxiety around abandoning aspects of motherhood, but it becomes essential. And in fact, a couple of them said, I knew I was committed to my leadership role when I had two nannies, a day nanny and a night nanny, because I had to travel. And then the big one as we go through that is support is organizational. Pick an employer who actually believes in gender equity, and that'll be a lot easier for you to advance within that environment. And then third is sponsorship. And that was one that Michelle and I will talk about in a big way is, we work under the premise that no one ever actually climbs the corporate ladder. They get dragged up it by the scruff of their neck by someone who wants to see them succeed. And it's that capacity to attract sponsorship, which is still very difficult for women, and more specifically women of color, because again, the people who are in the position to sponsor tend to reach down and sponsor So a white male is likely to be involved in networks and aligned intellectually and socially with other white males. And so it's just based on the numbers, the proportionality of it all. It's way easier for a young white male to attract a sponsor than it is for any other group in the organizations. And until we address those things and we get those four components of the CAPS model working, again, it's very difficult for women to compete on a head-to-head basis for their male peers for those scarce leadership positions.
So that cues us up to the next question. And so what I'd like to do is say, so Michelle, tell a little bit about kind of how you identify with being specifically a woman of color living in Canada. So I'm in the States, and so I'm just curious to hear this. So this was not prep. So the question is like, so what is there an extra, and if so, what extra challenge or obstacles do women of color specifically face and need to and have to overcome that maybe their white counterparts do not?
Yeah, no, happy to share some views on this topic, CJ. And I would say whether we're in Canada or the United States, there's work to be done
Sure.
across the board.
Sure.
And the reality is that burdens are not born equally across all women.
Mm.
So, the reality for women who intersect with another identity, a woman who's a member of the LGBTQ2S plus community, a woman of color, or a woman who intersects across more than even two identities, there's a very real feeling of isolation. And often a struggle with bringing their whole authentic self, frankly, because there's likely a fear of how that will be received. And so, when you think about isolation and not being able to bring, your true authentic self, they never really experience a true sense of belonging in an organization, right? If belonging is about being seen, heard, and valued, it's hard to achieve that if you don't feel the first couple, as I mentioned. As a woman of color, as an individual who identifies as a Black professional, we're often, I was often the one or the only in a room. Women of color also have fewer senior career role models, if they exist at all, frankly. Women of color contend with higher rates of microaggression. Microaggression, those indirect or subtle statements or acts of discrimination. And, the Catalyst organization out of the US and Canada, had done some work that really summarizes this essentially as an emotional tax. The need to be continually on guard, anticipating and consciously preparing for potential bias or discrimination, all of which can weigh greatly and frankly be exhausting, right? So, and so while organizations, again, as I mentioned earlier, have deepened commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I believe personally that it's going to take a truly concerted effort to improve the experiences for women of color. Not just leaders and employees and colleagues saying that they're allies, but by those same individuals regularly and genuinely demonstrating by advocating for better opportunities for women of color. It can't be a seasonal effort. That's not how transformation works. And frankly, in gender equity in general, we need tremendous transformation, but I believe for women of color, it's an even higher test and a higher lift.
So, Michelle, you said so much in that. I think just talking about mentorship, sponsorship, and allyship is a whole series. It's a book. It's a deep conversation for women in general, specifically African-American women, and as you mentioned, not just in North America, but globally. So so maybe that's an opportunity there. And one of the interesting things I just wanted to mention, there's a book called Black Fatigue that one of our colleagues wrote, and it's really interesting to see the level of stress. And obviously that would include women, but this specifically saying for people who identify people of color or Black. And what you mentioned being the only, I wanted to mention something about that. I delivered a training out in California in the United States, and for a pharmaceutical company, and a woman came up to me and said, she was an African-American woman. She was the only one in the room and for the 2-day training. And she said, it's very challenging being the only. And I was inspired by that conversation to do a video, to do it like just a quick, we posted it on Instagram and LinkedIn. And it went viral in 2 hours. We got almost 6,000 views. And I said, wow, there are people out there that feel like they're the only. And so it's really interesting to just to understand what that feels like and the drain, emotional drain. So, okay, so we could talk about this forever. The book is here. So I'll have you, Paul, to just at the end, just let them know where they can get the book. But I have one final question for both of you. If you were to give one PSA message to women in North America who are climbing the corporate lattice, that what is it going to take for, I wouldn't even say anything like that. What message would you give them who are trying to move up the ladder and in corporate America, in North America and beyond? And so this one, I'll just let you share kind of however if you need time to bubble up, let the other person go. But that's the final question. The one thing.
Go ahead, Michelle.
All right. Well, and Paul alluded to it earlier in the conversation, and we actually have not talked about how we're going to answer this, but it's something he knows and that I'm passionate about, and I know he's passionate about, and that's really about sponsorship. So find someone to sponsor you in your organization, and mentors are fantastic. Sponsors are even better.
Just define it a little bit for me.
Yeah. Well, I'll sum it up in just a phrase that I think says so much in few words, CJ. A mentor talks to you, and a sponsor talks about you. So sponsors are advocates. They have positions of influence. They help others advance intentionally with that. They will take risks because it is their reputation as they influence opportunities for individuals, right? And so sponsorship, I think as Paul mentioned earlier, is not, it's not prevalent enough in organizations. And so this is a bit of my own PSA for pushing to have that be more available in organizations. And the double click I'll make on this is a message also to the people sponsoring. So here's the thing. Sponsor 2 women and intentionally seek out somebody who does not look like you, who has not had the same lived experience as you. And because it is easy to sponsor a woman who, if you're a male executive and you're sponsoring a woman in the organization, it is easy to sponsor somebody who looks like you and who has had a similar lived experience. Sure. So let's do that. And this isn't an or, it's an and sponsor somebody else. So intentionally seek out a woman who has had a different lived experience. I as simplistic as this sounds, I really believe that doubling up on this effort will go a tremendously long way to not only sending a message of commitment, but to accelerating the leadership opportunities for women in organizations.
Michelle, you gave me goosebumps when you said that, the sponsorship piece, because it is so critical. I write about that in my book, which is Zip Code Story, and definitely someone who has a different lived experience. Because even if you're crossing gender, even if you're crossing race, and obviously once you cross race, I think you have more opportunity, different lived experiences. But if you have 2 people who have gone to private school all their lives, who've gone to Harvard all their lives, and they, but I just happen to be a woman. And so, so that's awesome. That's amazing. So Paul, please tell us your thought on that question, and please tell people how they can find you, the book. And Michelle, also, how can they find you before Paul closes us?
I'm on LinkedIn at Michelle Banik, Banik. Reach out, look me up. Always interested in having these kinds of conversations.
Awesome. Paul, close us out.
Great. Well, as I close out, first of all, CJ, thank you for allowing us to have this opportunity to tell the story. That's really what we're all about. Is if my wife always says when I took the book on, she said, if you change one life, it was a worthwhile exercise. And so if we can continue to change one life at a time based on these sessions, it's fabulous. And to my dear friend, Michelle, thank you as always for your help. And I apologize for the phone call here. What we do talk about in the book as well. And so I buy into the sponsorship entirely. It is essential. But we did ask the women too, said, so if you were going to change organizations, what do you need to change about it? What are the systemic fixes that can be undertaken? And certainly Michelle talked about it. And my response to every question in business is leadership. Leadership has to get on board. And by extension, white men have to get on board, because that is the plurality of leadership in most of the organizations we're talking about. But the women said, look, if you're going to fix things, there's 3 easy fixes. And I firmly believe, by the way, that they are easy fixes. They're disruptive, sure, but any kind of meaningful change in an organization is going to be disruptive. Is that a negative thing? So fix pay. If you accept that compensation is a proxy for your perceived value of people in your organization, then if you value people equally, pay them equally. And that's a spreadsheet exercise. I've heard stories of CEOs that have gone home with the say and taken a red pen and just changed and said, bring these people up, bring them up. We just, if everyone's paid the same for the jobs that they're doing, then a lot of this stuff goes away. The second is to debias the promotion process. So not only, it's try and debias all those elements, but always bring multiple people to the promotion discussions, even if they're not the preferred candidate. Let's work that thing through. And then on the back end, if they don't get the job, don't dismiss them. Say, now you understand what it takes. We understand your objective. We understand your capabilities. Let's coach you to the next level. So it's reaching down and helping to elevate, not waiting for this person to walk away with a negative perception and say, I'm not valued. And then the third is flexibility without guilt. And so there is this notion that flex programs, whether it's time off or other elements, have been provided as accommodations to women who needed time to look after the kids or to do whatever. I'm going to suggest to you that most men want to be active parents as well. But if you think women have a career, limiting component, taking time off, for a lot of men in organizations right now, that can be career killing to say, I'm going to take time off and be with my child. Fix that. Say to, and COVID's helped us a little bit here. Sure. Say to your employees, I trust you. Go to your kid's soccer game, go to the vet, whatever, just get your work done. Sure. Take the flexibility and do what needs to be done, and ensure that men understand, and I have this bias that every man should have to take a month off with each birth of each child to understand the exhaustion that goes with managing that child on a day-to-day basis, but just reintegrating after a month. Like, you've just been left off all the cool projects and all the email lists and all that stuff. And now you have to go and integrate just after 1 month. So if you can begin to build that sort of flexibility and that cultural mindset into the process, then you take away a lot of those 4 biases that we just mentioned. And that can be done with a stroke of a pen at a policy decision level at the leadership of any organization. Could happen tomorrow. So that would be my view is that if you're committed to this, and by the way, to the point, we're talking gender, but this really is in a DE&I perspective. Sure. The reality was I focused on gender because I wanted to get my thesis done and I didn't have enough volumes to deal with the broader DE&I issue. Sure. So we can fix all of those things. It just takes bravery from a leadership perspective. And if they have to wonder why, then just look at the business case. We begin to see over and over and over again that diverse organizations outperform homogeneous organizations. So for no other reason than to meet your business targets, do it.
Absolutely. So Paul, one last thing, where can they get the book? I got my copy, but where can they get the book?
Amazon.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michelle and Paul. Simple question. Thank you so much, Michelle and Paul, for this time. Awesome.